when we begin to unpack the concept of the super empath. It's essential that we resist the temptation to reduce it to mere sentimentality or vague spiritual jargon. This is simply someone who feels deeply or cries during sad movies. A super empath is, in psychological and existential terms, an anomaly, an individual who combines profound emotional sensitivity with an unusually high degree of self-awareness and resilience. And it's precisely this dual nature that makes the super empath such a formidable force in the face of narcissistic pathology. You see, empathy in its most basic form is the ability to feel what others feel. It's the psychological mechanism that allows us to connect, to form bonds. But most empaths, while emotionally attuned, lack the inner structure to hold the line when exposed to manipulation or emotional abuse. They absorb everything, often without discernment. They confuse compassion with compliance. But the super empath doesn't just feel. They see, they perceive motives beneath actions. They listen not only to what's being said, but to what's being concealed. There's a kind of moral radar operating in them, one that detects misalignment between a person's words and their intent. This perceptual clarity is often forged through hardship. Super empaths are not born whole. They're refined through fire. Whether it's childhood trauma, repeated emotional betrayals, or even early encounters with narcissistic figures, their depth of perception is the product of introspection born from suffering. Unlike the narcissist, who builds a grandiose false self to avoid fronting internal emptiness, the super empath confronts their inner chaos directly. They walk into the abyss voluntarily, wrestle with it, and emerge not unscathed, but integrated. And this makes them dangerous, not in a violent or vengeful way, but in the quiet, a stabilizing sense of someone who cannot be easily deceived or derailed. What distinguishes the super empath isn't just sensitivity, it's agency. Emotional intelligence without agency is just passive awareness. The super empath doesn't just know what's going on, they respond. Deliberately, strategically, often without a word. And here's where it becomes particularly threatening to the narcissist. The narcissist thrives in environments where emotional chaos reigns, where people are reactive, insecure, easily provoked. But the super empath doesn't play that game. They don't react, they observe, they don't chase. They detach. Their power lies in stillness, in not giving the narcissist what they so desperately seeking: emotional validation and control. From a philosophical lens, the super empath represents a form of existential courage. In a world increasingly driven by superficiality, distraction, and ego reinforcement, the super empath embodies a quiet rebellion. They live attuned to truth, not illusion. And this, in the psychological ecosystem of human relationships, destabilizes the narcissist. Because at their core, narcissists are terrified of being seen, not adored, not admired, seen, and the super empath sees them clearly, not with judgment, but with penetrating insight. That's the kryptonite. But let's not romanticize the super empath either. Their journey is not easy. They are often misunderstood, sometimes even gaslit into thinking their depth is a weakness. But that very depth, the capacity to feel fully and still choose integrity over reaction, is what makes them rare. They are not above pain, they simply refuse to be defined by it. And unlike the narcissist, who needs a constant stream of external affirmation to feel real, the super empath sources their identity from within. So when these two forces meet, one fueled by illusion, the other anchored in truth, a confrontation becomes inevitable. The narcissist, initially drawn to the empath's emotional richness, quickly senses a threat they cannot name. It's not just that the super empath won't submit, it's that they refuse to abandon themselves. And in the realm of narcissistic dynamics, that's not just rare, it's revolutionary. At the heart of it, the super empath doesn't destroy the narcissist, they expose them, not through aggression, but by simply remaining intact. In a world of masks, the one who shows up without one changes the entire atmosphere. And so I leave you with this in a time when manipulation often wears the mask of charm and cruelty hides behind charisma. The most radical thing you do is to see clearly and remain whole. Be that radical. Be that light. To truly understand the conflict between the super empath and the narcissist, we have to first dissect the psychology of the narcissist with a sober, critical lens. And not just in terms of popular labels or online caricatures, but through the core structures that shape how narcissists think, feel, and behave. You see, the narcissist is not merely arrogant or selfish. Those are just symptoms. At the root of narcissism lies a fractured sense of identity, a kind of ontological insecurity that drives them to construct a false self, an idealized image they present to the world in order to shield themselves from the unbearable truth of their own inadequacy. At a deep psychological level, the narcissist's life is not guided by authenticity, but by performance. They crave admiration, not affection, control, not connection. And this is not a preference, it's a compulsion. They need a steady stream of external validation just to hold themselves together, because without it, the carefully curated masks to crack, and what lies beneath is often shame, emptiness, and fear. So their entire relational strategy becomes about manipulating others into reflecting back the version of themselves they wish were real. They don't engage in relationships, they orchestrate them. Control is central here. The narcissist does not relate to people as independent beings with their own value, but as instruments, mirrors, to reflect their imagined greatness. When those mirrors cooperate, the narcissist appears charismatic, even generous. But when the reflection begins to distort, when someone questions them, challenges their narrative, or simply stops feeding their ego, they become cold, critical, and often cruel. It's not personal, it's structural. You are no longer useful to the maintenance of the faade. Now, the narcissist's tactics are rarely overt. They've learned to camouflage, gaslighting, triangulation, silent treatments. These are not random behaviors. They're calculated maneuvers designed to destabilize others and assert dominance without appearing overtly abusive. And the more intelligent the narcissist, the more refined the manipulation becomes. They often adopt masks of virtue, kindness, humility, even empathy, when it serves their image. But these masks are paper thin, and the super empath, unlike most, has the vision to see through them. What's crucial to recognize is that narcissists aren't simply malicious. They're deeply afraid. Afraid of being exposed, of being ordinary, of being unworthy. Their entire psychological architecture is built around avoiding that realization. And that's why they react with such disproportionate rage or disdain when challenged. You're not just disagreeing with them. You're threatening their very sense of existence. This is where the dynamic becomes interesting. Most people, when they encounter a narcissist, are thrown off balance. They feel confused, guilty, uncertain. They begin to question their own perceptions. This is by design. The narcissist thrives in ambiguity because it grants them control. But the super empath introduces something the narcissist cannot easily manage in clarity. The super empath sees the game, names it, and refuses to play along. And this refusal isn't aggressive, it's grounded. That's what makes it so destabilizing. You see, narcissists are masters of narrative. They tell stories about themselves, about others, about the relationship. They craft these stories with precision, always casting themselves in the role of hero or victim. But the super empath has a different kind of narrative intelligence. They don't just hear the story, they sense the subtext. They feel the dissonance between what is being said and what is actually occurring. They listen not to be persuaded, but to understand, and that makes them ungovernable. The narcissist needs dominance, but the super empath brings equilibrium. They don't fight for power, they radiate presence. They don't need to win arguments because they're not operating from insecurity. And it's that internal security that short-circuits the narcissist system. Because when manipulation fails to yield control, when projection fails to provoke guilt, the narcissist is left with the one thing they fear most in themselves. And perhaps that's the most profound difference between the two. The narcissist constructs a false self to avoid their pain. The super empath confronts their pain to build their true self. One hides, the other integrates. One manipulates reality, the other accepts it. And that difference doesn't just define their interaction, it determines the outcome. So if you ever find yourself questioning why the narcissist behaves the way they do, why they must dominate, why they distort, why they cannot seem to love without condition, the answer is this: they are not relating to you, they are defending themselves from you, from the threat you pose to their illusion. And that's the thought I want to leave you with. The narcissist fears the truth, and the super empath is the truth. Be that truth. Because in a world built on facades, your clarity is not just rare, it's revolutionary. If we've established that the narcissist operates through manipulation and the super empath functions through clarity, then we're now confronted with the question of what happens when these two forces collide. And the answer, quite simply, is rupture. Not necessarily an explosive one, at least not right away, but a rupture in the narcissist's control structure. Because here's the psychological reality: Narcissistic patterns require compliant participants. They require people who can be baited, guilted, emotionally destabilized. Without that, the system fails. And this is precisely what the super empath brings to the table, a disruption of the narcissist's relational algorithm. The super empath breaks the cycle. That's the essence of this point. Most people entangled with narcissists fall into one of two categories: enablers or reactors. Enablers support the narcissist's ego in order to keep the peace. Reactors challenge them, but emotionally, through anger, confusion, defensiveness, which only feeds the narcissist's need for engagement and control. Both roles, though opposite in tone, serve the narcissist's psychological needs. The super empath, however, does something radically different. They observe. They maintain emotional sovereignty. They recognize the game being played, and crucially, they refuse to play it. This refusal isn't pride or a desire for revenge. It's the result of integration. The super empath has, through suffering and introspection, confronted their own emotional shadows. They're not looking for someone to complete them. They're not dependent on external approval to feel whole. And that's what makes them so dangerous in this context, because they cannot be hooked by the usual tactics: love bombing, guilt, projection, gaslighting. They see these patterns not as personal attacks, but as psychological defenses. And by understanding that, they neutralize the power behind them. The narcissist is often unaware of just how much they rely on others to regulate their inner state. Their emotional life is outsourced. They need others to mirror back a version of themselves that they can tolerate. But the super empath, by staying grounded, stops mirroring entirely. They don't rage when provoked. They don't collapse when abandoned. They remain composed, which to the narcissist feels like abandonment, because they're not being emotionally echoed. This composure forces the narcissist to confront the very emptiness they're trying to outrun. And here's where the rupture begins to deepen. The narcissist will often escalate their efforts, testing boundaries, increasing the intensity of their manipulation, in a last-ditch attempt to regain control. But instead of reacting, the super empath sets limits, firmly, without drama. That stillness, that refusal to emotionally engage in the narcissist's theater, acts like a psychological mirror, reflecting back the dysfunction with surgical precision. And what does the narcissist see in that reflection? Not admiration, not validation, but their own disintegrating persona. This is not a battle of good versus evil. That kind of moral framing, while satisfying, is too simplistic. What we're dealing with here is a confrontation between truth and illusion. The narcissist cannot maintain their illusion in the presence of someone who refuses to reinforce it. And the super empath, by staying anchored in their own truth, becomes the immovable object that the narcissist's force cannot penetrate. But it's important to emphasize that this dynamic doesn't mean the super empath is invulnerable. Far from it. Their strength comes precisely from having been vulnerable, having suffered, having seen themselves clearly, having done the inner work. That's what gives them the capacity to endure the confusion, the gaslighting, the emotional chaos, and still return to center. And in doing so, they model a different kind of power. A power that doesn't dominate but liberates. A power that doesn't seek revenge but refuses to self-abandon. Over time, the narcissist begins to lose control, not just over the super empath, but over the narrative they've built around themselves. And that's the beginning of transformation, if it happens at all. Because once the narcissist can no longer sustain the illusion, they are either forced to confront their inner emptiness, or they retreat into deeper denial. The choice is theirs. But either way, the super empath walks away not untouched, but whole. And this is the larger truth that must be understood. You don't break the narcissist by fighting them. You break the cycle by refusing to abandon yourself. That's the paradox. The more you return to your own integrity, your own clarity, your own peace, the more their power dissolves. So here's what I leave you with. Real power doesn't shout, it doesn't demand. It simply does not yield to illusion, be that kind of powerful. One of the most psychologically profound phenomena in the interaction between the super empath and the narcissist is what I would call the mirror effect. And this isn't just metaphorical. It's not poetry, it's structure. It is rooted in the fundamental mechanics of how the narcissist experiences the self, and more importantly, how they avoid experiencing the self. The super empath, often without realizing it at first, becomes the mirror the narcissist has spent a lifetime avoiding. And not the kind of mirror that flatters or reflects a curated image, but a truthful one. an unfiltered, piercing reflection of who they really are. Now, the narcissist spends an extraordinary amount of psychic energy constructing and maintaining a false self, an idealized persona built to mask shame, inadequacy, and fear. And because that mask is so fragile, it requires constant reinforcement from others. It can't exist in isolation. It must be validated externally. That's why narcissists gravitate toward people who reflect back admiration, who affirm the persona without questioning the foundation. But the super empath, precisely because of their clarity, emotional intelligence, and commitment to truth, inevitably disrupts this process. What happens when the narcissist sees themselves reflected in the super empath's perception as a kind of existential threat? Not because the empath is hostile, but because they are lucid. The narcissist, for the first time perhaps, is not flattered, not indulged, not enabled, but seen fully. And that kind of seeing is unbearable to someone whose entire psychological structure is built around hiding. You see, the empath's ability to perceive death becomes a liability to the narcissist's illusion. While others might overlook inconsistencies or rationalize the narcissist's behavior, the super empath registers the dissonance. They feel it in the body. They hear it in the tone, in the timing, and what's not said. They sense the fracture between persona and truth. And this is key. They don't react with aggression, which would be expected and manageable. Instead, they respond with clarity, calmness, observation. And that calm gaze is like acid to the narcissist's armor, because it does something dangerous. It invites self-awareness. But here's the catch. Narcissists don't want self-awareness. They fear it. They avoid it precisely because self-awareness would expose the brokenness underneath the grandiosity. And so the mirror the super empath holds up is not received with gratitude. It's met with rage, contempt, or withdrawal. It triggers what some psychologists call narcissistic injury, a profound emotional wound caused not by violence, but by exposure. The mask cracks. And what comes out is either narcissistic rage, an attempt to destroy the source of that reflection, or narcissistic collapse, a retreat into despair and avoidance. The empath, of course, often doesn't understand what they've triggered. They didn't attack. They simply saw. They held space. They asked questions. They told the truth. And yet, suddenly, they are treated as the enemy. This reversal can be jarring. But it's essential to recognize what's really happening here. The super empath has forced the narcissist into contact with the very thing they've spent their life avoiding themselves. And that's why the super empath becomes just immune to manipulation, but a catalyst for exposure. The empath's stillness doesn't just resist the narcissist. It reveals them. It pulls back the curtain. And when there's no longer a place to hide, the narcissist has only two options: face what's been hidden, or destroy the mirror. That's where the dynamic can become volatile, because few people, when forced to see the truth about themselves, respond with grace, especially not those who have their identity on illusion. And yet, this is precisely the function the super empath fulfills, not as a therapist, not as a savior, but as a reflection. Their gift is not just in feeling deeply, but in seeing truly. And truth, in any form, is always disruptive to illusion. But we need to be clearing, it is not the empath's job to fix the narcissist. That path leads only to exhaustion and self-erasure. The power of the mirror lies not in changing the image it reflects, but in offering the opportunity to see. Whether or not the narcissist takes that opportunity is not the empath's responsibility. Their responsibility is to maintain the mirror, to remain aligned with truth, even when the reflection provokes retaliation. And here's the final point. In a world increasingly dominated by performance, by curated identities, and by ego-driven interactions, the act of seeing clearly and refusing to look away is a revolutionary act. Not just for the narcissist, but for society at large. The super empath doesn't just hold individuals accountable. They hold reality accountable. They insist on what is real, and that insistence, quiet as it may be, is the most powerful force of all. So remember this: when you reflect truth without distortion, you will unsettle illusions. But don't flinch, because the courage to see and to be seen is what breaks cycles and transforms lives. Be the mirror that cannot be shattered. To truly understand the transformative power of the super empath, we must look beyond their ability to see through manipulation or remain emotionally grounded. There is a deeper force at play here, one that transcends mere resistance. The super empath, in their capacity to love fully without losing themselves, possesses a strength that is not only resilient but empowered. Their journey is not about merely surviving toxic dynamics. It's about transcending them. This is where the concept of empowered compassion comes into play. The super empath is not a passive victim of narcissistic influence, but someone who actively chooses to walk away when necessary without sacrificing their sense of self. And that is no small feat. The narcissist's primary weapon is emotional coercion. They use guilt, shame, manipulation, and intermittent reinforcement to entrap others in a state of confusion and dependency. The narcissist thrives on creating emotional debt, making people feel indebted to them, making them believe that their worth is tied to serving the narcissist's needs, no matter how destructive those needs may be. Over time, this dynamic erodes a person's sense of autonomy, leading them to question their own value, their own decisions, their own boundaries. But the super empath doesn't fall into this trap. Why? Because they've done the work. They've learned to differentiate between love and need, between connection and dependency. They understand that true love does not ask for self-abandonment. They understand that connection with another person should never come at the cost of their own identity. And because of this understanding, when faced with toxic dynamics, they are able to make a decision that is both painful and liberating. They walk away. This act of walking away is not a retreat, it's a declaration of self-preservation. It's a conscious decision to stop the cycle, to stop playing the game, to refuse to allow themselves to be emotionally manipulated any longer. But this decision doesn't come easily. It comes after years, sometimes decades, of learning to recognize the patterns of abuse and manipulation. It comes after a process of reclaiming their own voice, their own worth, and their own sense of agency. The super empath doesn't walk away in a moment of anger. They walk away in a moment of clarity. One of the reasons this is so powerful is that the narcissist is deeply reliant on the emotional dependency of others. They need the validation, the admiration, the attention of others to sustain their fragile sense of self. When the super empath walks away, it's as if the foundation they've built entire identity on begins to crumble. The narcissist is faced not with an angry confrontation, but with the quiet absence of the empath's emotional investment. This absence is not just physical, it's existential. The narcissist, whose entire existence is built on the illusion of control and validation, is now confronted with a reality they cannot manipulate. They cannot guilt the super empath into staying. They cannot use their usual tactics of emotional manipulation. And that absence, the absence of the empath's presence, on the absence of their emotional energy, can be more devastating than any confrontation. For the super empath, walking away isn't about winning or defeating the narcissist. It's not about striking back or seeking revenge. It's about recognizing their own worth and choosing to protect it. And this, ultimately, is the most powerful thing the super empath can do. It is an act of self-love and self-respect. The super empath understands that their energy, their time, their love is not infinite. And so, when they choose to withdraw it from a toxic situation, they are reclaiming their power, not by forcing the narcissist to change, but by refusing to be complicit in their illusion any longer. This is a crucial point because walking away is not just an act of disengagement, it's an act of transformation. The super empath does not walk away from the narcissist because they are broken, defeated, or disillusioned. They walk away because they are whole. And it is this wholeness that makes them impervious to the narcissist's games. It is this sense of inner completeness that allows them to walk away without second-guessing themselves or feeling guilty. They have learned to distinguish between love and control, between emotional connection and emotional manipulation. And in doing so, they create the conditions for their own healing and growth. The moment they walk away, they reclaim their energy, their autonomy, and their peace of mind. They can now focus on rebuilding, refocusing, and realigning with their true selves. This process of reclamation, of self-restoration, is what allows them to rise above the toxicity they have experienced. It is what enables them to transform their pain into wisdom, their suffering into strength. But here's the powerful paradox: by walking away, the super empath doesn't just reclaim their own power. They force the narcissist to face a truth they would rather avoid. That they are not invincible. That they are not the center of the universe. That their need for control is ultimately futile. And while the narcissist may never fully internalize this lesson, the super empath's ability to walk away marks a moment of truth for both parties. So, as we reflect on this, let me leave you with this. The power of the super empath is not in their ability to endure the storm of narcissism, but in their ability to leave the storm. To walk away not in defeat, but in victory. To recognize their worth and protect it regardless of the chaos around them. That is the truest form of power, walking away from what no longer serves you and reclaiming the peace that is rightfully yours. Be that empowered force. Don't just survive. Thrive. The final and perhaps most profound element of the super empath's power is their ability to shift the dynamics in the long term. While much of the previous discussion has focused on the immediate confrontation, the breaking of the cycle, the refusal to comply with the narcissist's manipulation, there's a deeper, more enduring impact that the super empath has, a kind of seismic ripple effect that extends far beyond the personal relationship and into the world at large. What is most remarkable about the super empath's presence in a narcissistic dynamic is not simply their ability to resist, not their capacity for resilience, but their ability to catalyze transformation. The narcissist may try at first to reassert control, to find another victim, to manipulate the environment back into their favor. But the super empath, by simply remaining true to themselves and choosing not to be manipulated, creates a shift in the fundamental power structures that the narcissist has so carefully erected. They challenge the very premise that underpins the narcissist's worldview. That people exist to serve their ego, that relationships are transactional, that power is gained through manipulation. When the super empath holds their ground and refuses to mirror the narcissist's needs, it forces the narcissist to confront something they've spent their life avoiding, their own insecurities. This is not an immediate process. In fact, many narcissists will never fully realize the transformation they've undergone as their denial is so ingrained. But the fact remains, the narcissist's world has been permanently altered. They have encountered an emotional force they cannot control, an individual whose presence cannot be influenced or shaped by their usual tactics. And while they may attempt to salvage the situation through further manipulation, the super empath's unwavering stance has planted a seed of doubt in the narcissist's mind. What is so powerful about this shift is that the super empath doesn't need to engage in overt confrontation or argumentation to achieve it. They don't need to engage in a battle of wills. Their mere refusal to comply with the narcissist's demands is enough to disrupt the entire foundation of the narcissist's psychological world. The narcissist is forced to reconsider their methods of gaining control, and that in itself can begin to unravel their behavior. It may not happen in a day, a week, or even a year, but every time the super empath remains anchored in their truth, every time they refuse to engage with the narcissist's manipulations, they reinforce a reality in which the narcissist's power is less absolute. Over time, this leads to an internal shift for both parties. For the narcissist, this could manifest as a kind of slow, burning crisis, a crisis of identity. They begin to realize that they cannot sustain their inflated self-image without constant external validation. And for the super empath, this creates a profound sense of empowerment. It is through this process that the super empath learns the true nature of their strength. It's not simply the ability to endure, it's the ability to choose the terms of their own reality. But perhaps the most significant aspect of this long-term transformation is the shift in how the super empath relates to the world. The impact of walking away from a narcissist is not just a personal victory, it sends a ripple of influence into all their relationships. By asserting boundaries, by refusing to compromise their integrity, the super empath becomes a model for others. They demonstrate what it means to live authentically, to act with integrity, and to prioritize self-respect over external approval. And that's contagious. Other people, especially those in close relationships with the narcissist, may start to see the dynamics more clearly. They begin to recognize how manipulation, control, and emotional coercion are playing out in their own lives, often for the first time. They see the super empath stand firm, and they begin to question why they are allowing the same tactics to be used on them. In this way, the super empath becomes not just an individual force for good, but a catalyst for collective change. In the workplace, in families, in friendships, the power of the super empath extends far beyond their immediate relationship with the narcissist. They inspire others to reclaim their own boundaries, to assert their own self-worth, to choose relationships that are based on mutual respect rather than power dynamics. They provide a blueprint for what it means to live in alignment with one's values, not as a passive participant in someone else's narrative, but as an active creator of one's own life. This ability to inspire change doesn't come from overt activism or grand gestures. It comes from the quiet, steady power of being true to oneself in a world that often encourages conformity. It comes from the strength to walk away from situations that no longer serve you, to choose clarity over confusion, and to prioritize truth over manipulation. The super empath doesn't need to shout for justice. They embody it. And so, as we reflect on this, let me leave you with this thought: in a world rife with ego-driven manipulation, the true power lies not in dominating others, but in dominating oneself, in maintaining emotional sovereignty, in choosing clarity over chaos, and in being a living testament to the possibility of authentic connection. The super empath does not merely survive in the face of narcissism. They transform the entire environment. Their power lies not in resistance, but in embodiment. And that, my friends, is the kind of power that can change not just individual lives, but the world itself. If you want to leave your mark on the world, then embody your truth. Walk away from the manipulation. Stand firm in your clarity. Be the change you wish to see, and in doing so, invite others to join you in creating a world where authenticity, not manipulation, reigns supreme.